Everyone has been wondering why I've been setting up a second channel. Here's why. I am joined today by what many of you know as Internet Brandon Sanderson. I know him as Noah King.
Hey guys.
Wave to the camera that's actually the audience, Noah.
Hey guys.
There we go. And I have been confined to science fiction and fantasy for years, which I love. But now with this opportunity and this joint venture with one of my best friends, we get to branch outside of that. And I figured there's no better place to start than the spicy hot film right now that everyone's talking about, the 1957 classic 12 Angry Men. How'd you like the movie, Noah?
I loved this movie. I haven't seen it since I was in high school, and frankly, I thought it really held up.
And it falls into one of the two. There's two camps for perfect films for me. Perfect films that I think everyone will love, and perfect films that I think some people still might not like. And this is the latter.
It's so well done, and like it's really captivating, and just sort of the lines, the speeches of all of the characters. They're really, I mean, they're super intentional. It's really well directed. That being said, like, this is not indicative of what an actual jury would look like, right? Like, this is not a jury of your peers. It's 12 straight white men.
Funny thing, Kayla and I watched this together for this episode, and she was like, why is it men? So she looked up, like, when could women serve on a jury? And we found out, yeah, same year this movie came out was when women could finally serve on a jury like this, at least at, like, the federal crime level.
Women, I think, have actually been able to serve on a jury since 1860, but it was, like, it was like state to state, and it was mostly rural states because it was on an opt-in basis. So women could like elect to be on the jury, but they were like, you probably not wanted here. You know, your husband maybe needs you more in the house than like on the jury.
Which is what Noah believes. Someone clip it.
That's not that's not true. But the other thing is like, they're like, oh, well, you know, women are too emotional to be on a jury. Unlike these 12 men who keep their heads so cool the entire time.
So for those of you who haven't seen the movie, it is currently free if you have Amazon Prime, and I think like $3 to rent almost everywhere else. And the basic story, if I want to just drastically over summarize it, is there's a jury of 12 men, and they are deciding whether or not an 18-year-old child should get the electric chair for murdering his father with what seems to be an overwhelming amount of evidence pointing... I burped. I ruined it so much, but we're keeping it in. For getting the electric chair for what seems an overwhelming amount of evidence for murdering his father.
That pretty much sums it up. And all 12 of the jurors at first you think are going to, it seems like there's an overwhelming amount of evidence to sentence this boy to be electrocuted. And as they're going around, 11 of them vote guilty, and juror number 8, played by Henry Fonda, who also, I believe, produced the movie, not directed it, because that was Sidney Lumet, votes not guilty. The rest of the movie is him slowly persuading the rest of the jurors and convincing them that there is some evidence that wasn't thoroughly investigated that could potentially clear this boy's name.
And it's funny, the movie actually never directly tells you whether or not the boy is guilty or innocent. They just establish reasonable doubt due to exploring ideas of, you know, lawyers who don't care, blatant classism and racism, just kind of showing that this boy did not actually get a fair trial. There was just so much that was not examined. And to be perfectly clear, this is my 4th time watching the movie. I love this movie, and this time what stood out to me was how well the blocking was done. I mean, this basically, it feels like a play, at least the way they constantly are moving around to me, exercising the space. Except from the opening and closing, this whole movie takes place essentially in just 2 rooms, a bathroom and the juror room.
Their bottle episode, right? Like,
yeah, it really is. And they are just exercising that space, but they justify the movements constantly with the heat, making them open the windows, putting their jackets away, grabbing a cough drop. So it does feel claustrophobic, but it doesn't feel tired.
And the other thing that they do really exceptionally well with that is, number one, the heat, the use of heat throughout the film, right? Where it's just like, it's this oppressive heat. It's supposed to be like the hottest day of the year or something, and they keep referencing it in the beginning of the film. And you can tell that it has like an effect on all of their emotions, right? It just feels, you can feel this like tension in the room, this tension in the air, even before any of the jurors like have said whether or not they believe the boy is guilty. And then on top of that, one of the other things that I wanted to talk about that you sort of mentioned was like the use of movement and the use and just sort of like the angles of the camera. As the film goes on, you notice that like the camera gets closer and closer to people's faces, so it's an exaggerated view of these people's emotions. The closer you get to the face, the more you just feel like what that person is feeling, instead of seeing like their full physicality, like how they're positioned, what they're doing. One of the other things that I thought was interesting too is that that you brought up too is that it feels a lot like a play,
Yeah.
which I think you mentioned to me, and you also know is because it was in fact a play before it was a movie, right?
The director put aside their ego, didn't decide to change it and make it a whole different vision. They just went, no, this fits as a play. Let's block it as such, which is just so effective in the presentation.
Also, so typically in like any kind of TV show or movie, you would have three walls, right, at any given moment that you could see. And apparently, like the budget for this film was not, it wasn't like a high budget film or anything, and so they only ever had like two walls at a time that they could film. So they had to like,
Really?
yes, so they had to like actually move the camera around and have all of the like actors like know literally all of their steps and where they needed to be, so that they could avoid shooting like an empty, like, right, like shooting just like the back lot or something.
That makes it even more impressive. There's about a 10-minute, like 5 to 10 minute one shot once you enter the juror room. That kind of is the initiation of how this is going to go down. And it's used just continually pushing in. The camera is so dynamically moving from actor to actor, just establishing who they are. And you also, getting into the narrative a little bit, see the people with the strongest personalities who definitely believe this kid is guilty start just convincing everyone, like, you're an idiot if you don't vote guilty. Like, obviously this kid's guilty. Like, we're all gonna vote guilty. Get out of here. I got a game to get to. Like, screw this. We're done. And it really, like, not all of them are certain of their guilt. It feels just like this weird social pressure where, like, these people who wanted to get out made everyone be like, okay, we're gonna get done and get out of here. It's fine. And there is just that one guy, Juror 8, who's like, we're about to send someone to the electric chair.
Everyone else from the jump is like, he's guilty. He's obviously guilty. You're an idiot if you don't think he's guilty. And juror number 8, the guy who opposes them, is not like, I think he's not guilty. He just says, I don't know. I don't know what I believe. But I think that if we're going to sentence someone to death, then he deserves it, like the courtesy of at least talking about it, right? Like, we can't sentence a boy to death in 5 minutes. And I think he makes an argument early on. The baseball game doesn't start until 8 o'clock. That gives us like at least an hour's worth of time to talk about this boy's fate, instead of just 5 minutes. And I wanted to point out too, one of the things that you said about sort of the whole room. There's only so many people who like definitely believe that the boy is guilty.
I think it's about 4 of them are passionately saying he's guilty. And that's what I was saying. I just disagree, because when they first go around and say, why is everyone voting guilty? There's more than a couple people who are just kind of like, hey, just...
Hell, they're just being strong-armed into it, or they're just like conforming. And juror number 7, the guy sitting right next to juror number 8, the guy sitting right next to Henry Fonda, is probably my least favorite. And he's the one who, towards the end, he switches his vote to not guilty, and he's one of the few in that instance when they take a vote, when they take a poll, he's one of the few people to switch to not guilty. And the European man, the watchmaker, says like, "Oh well, we have a right to know why you switched your vote," and he can't, despite having heard all of these arguments, all of this evidence against the boy being sent to the chair, he like can't come up with anything. It's just that like now the favor is like towards not guilty, and he's like, oh, I just, he's not guilty, like he's clearly not guilty. And the guy's like, what kind of a man, what kind of a person does that? Like you had no reasoning to kill the boy, and now you have no reasoning to spare his life. Like, that's the worst kind of person, is just the person who's like, is just silent, right?
If we're gonna get into characters, I gotta say, yes, juror number 7 is probably the most obnoxious for several reasons. But the one I hate the most, and I can't believe this is what you hate the most, is juror 10, who's just a bigot. Like, that's his entire character.
Oh, the
is he
race,
starts,
like,
yeah, he starts very like nudge, like, I'm kind of racist, and by the end, he's literally like going like, "There's no good ones. We should kill them all." Like,
yeah,
wow.
he's like, he's yelling at everyone, and he's like, and he's making his point for why they're all terrible, and then he's like, well, I mean, they're not all terrible. Like, I've met a couple of good ones, sure, but they're the exceptions. And like, as people like literally leave the table and turn their backs on him, like they're literally turning their backs on him, then he's like, no, wait, no, they are all terrible. Like, he doesn't even hold to that.
Yeah.
There's also like I love that after that scene because it's this beautiful scene where he just starts spewing this hateful rhetoric. Everyone turns their backs except for the uber logical guy who keeps his seat just to basically say, "Don't open your mouth again, shut up," which is great.
Yeah.
I love that for his character. But he then kind of like this guy is just then removed from the table and sits in the corner and just has an existential crisis
Yeah.
for the rest of the movie because he realizes how much of a hateful asshole he is.
He's got his own little like exile island. Like the entire time, you never see this like separate table that's off in the corner, and then all of a sudden, like just for the purposes of this guy being like, I need a place to sit down and collect myself. It's like it's there. I hate juror number 10. He's terrible. But I have a stronger dislike for the guy who just really could care less about, he just wants to go see a baseball game. I love that they hold a character like that accountable, that it's not just the loudmouth people who they're like, we have to change these people's minds. It's also the person who's silent, who still is culpable and should be accountable, right?
And this movie is really just a breakdown of all kinds of different people's psychological problems and how they would have just agreed to kill this kid so easily, because there's a few that, like, in hindsight, rewatching it, I'm like, why did the juror number 11, the Italian watchmaker, he feels like he should have never voted guilty, right? Because by the end, he's so compassionate. It's like, why was he? But that's where it gets into the psychology at the beginning of groupthink, where it's just like, all they're thinking is like, oh, everyone's doing it, so I guess this is obvious. But as soon as you trigger that humanity, a lot of them start flipping. And obviously the first one to flip outside of 8 is juror number 9.
Yeah, I love juror number, is it 9 who's the old man? He's sitting right now. Yeah, he's brilliant, and he plays the role so well too. And when he talks about one of the witnesses that they called to the stand is this old man who claims that he heard the boy saying, "I'm gonna kill you," and he like hears the body drop, and the old man gives this little like speech to the table about like, about the man, the witness possibly lying. And they're like, and all the other jurors say like, how could you possibly know if the man was lying? And he gives this beautiful speech about like, did you notice that the man had a ripped jacket? Like, who shows up to court in a ripped jacket? Did you notice that he had like a limp on his left leg? And, this is a man who's 75 years old, who hasn't been heard his entire life, who's like never been in the papers, never been quoted for anything. This is a lonely man who just wants a little bit of attention. And so he's like, maybe he didn't even lie. Maybe he just convinced himself that that's what he heard.
Which for a 1957 movie was far more like nuanced in the psychology of someone like that than I thought it would be. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't think that would be something this film would have the ability to get into and dissect, but it's an extremely common, real thing of how witnesses are not trustworthy at all.
Memory is super fallible, and yet like everyone takes these witnesses' accounts at face value, and juror number 8's the only one who's like, it was 12:10 in the morning, and this woman who has glasses and woke up from like a restless night of sleeping looked out through her window through a passing by L train and claims that she saw the boy in the act, like stabbing his father.
Yeah. And all the people who are like fiercely for this boy being guilty, like juror number 3, 4, 7, and 10. Yes, I am cheating, audience, and looking at a list. There is no way I would have done that otherwise. They each have a very specific angle the movie tears apart. Like juror number 4 is this hyper-logical, hey, it's just someone who convinced themselves, and now they have a hard time accepting any other truth besides their own. And that's the kind of like, there are really smart people who use logic, but they get stuck in their logic. And then once you break it down, they can turn around. There's juror number 7, where it's apathy. He just doesn't give a shit. Like, right? Like, he's just like, whatever, you kill the kid, I want to get to the baseball game. 10 is just raw bigotry. And then I want to say like 3, it's more of like it is bigotry as well. The guy's a bigot too. But it's also this like personal tied in vendetta with like, he feels like a failure as a father. So he's extra angry at this kid that he sees as a screw up.
Very clearly like projecting the frustrations that he has with his own son onto this like 18-year-old boy. That's one of the first speeches that you hear in the beginning of the movie is him talking about, those damn kids, like you give your whole life to them, and he just sort of gets flustered and sort of goes silent. And he's the last man to be swayed, I believe, at the very end of the movie. And he's like, he gives this like impassioned, like furious speech about what are we all doing? Like, why are you all switching your votes? And he takes out his wallet and he's like talking about the kid, and then he like sees a photo of his own son, and he just has this like moment of like raw emotion. And I think one of the things that's good about juror number 3, even though he is bigoted, even though he is like completely steered and guided by his emotions, is like he does eventually, there is eventually like a breakthrough, and he sees sort of like he sees the
I
error.
would disagree in a sense where I don't think he sees the. Yes, he sees the error of his ways, but I think it's more personal than that saying implies in a sense because it's really like his own internal resentment towards his child going from the subconscious to the conscious. Like we're seeing him subconsciously pull out his wallet and tear up a photo of his son, a bit blunt, which this movie is. It's a very blunt movie. As he is like having this revelation where the anger is bubbling over to a point where he realizes he's actually screaming about his child.
The things that you brought up just a few minutes ago that I wanted to touch on was just how well a film that was made in 1957 was able to dive into like human psychology and the ideas of groupthink, which were like fairly recent at the time, and just sort of like delving in, like doing a little bit of psychoanalysis, sort of this like collection of like the 12 personalities that you might find any given day on the streets of like 1957 America, is not only that, but like the way that it touches on racism. Like this is a pretty major conversation for a fairly large film to have, a fairly mainstream film to have in America. And the one thing that's super interesting about that is they never actually like they never like outright say the race of the child.
Yeah.
Right? You get one glimpse of him super early on in the film, and he could be anything. And I think in the original play, he's supposed to be like Puerto Rican or something. But the thing that they make really clear is not that he's like, he's not black, he's not Hispanic, he's not, whatever kind of like, they don't label him. It's just a them.
We'd be remiss if we didn't bring, well, Juror 2 and Juror 12, I think there's not too much of them. You don't need to talk about them that much. They don't do a whole lot aside from just change their mind. 12 literally is just kind of asked casually, like, have you changed your mind? He's like, yeah, like there's no huge thing for them. But Juror number 5 is the one who's also the other. He's in this room and they can't tell, but he grew up in slums. He grew up in knife fights. And they keep saying these bigoted things and he keeps getting angrier and angrier. Where at first he's kind of like, shut up. And then at other points he's standing up and saying like, why are you dehumanizing him? Like he just keeps kind of making the point that you're talking about a human being. And that's what really gets obviously the bigoted juror number 10 going. And that's like where you hear the first time the saying like, well, you're one of the good ones, when like they point at him, which is obviously one of the most racist things you could possibly say.
They're saying all these bigoted things, and then he finally reaches his tipping point and he says, I grew up in the slums my whole life, maybe you can still smell the garbage on me. And they're all like, oh, well, don't be so sensitive, like we're obviously not talking about you. And it's like, that's not the point. Like, you can't just like say those things. You can't just like you can't just be incredibly racist and like, oh, but not you, of course. Like you're one of the exceptions to the rule. Like that's still not an acceptable way to talk about any group of people.
But the first time when he initially speaks up, he's not really like loud or adamant towards anyone. He just sort of like calmly stands up and like raises his voice a little bit, only to say like, I think I know this boy. Like I grew up in the slums my whole life. Like maybe you can still smell it on me, but I played in back lots where that were filled with garbage. And because I think that's the only way that you could really get them to listen to you. If you yell back at them, they're just going to have like a reason. They're going to add another reason on to like why that kind of person is not trustworthy.
He has like that extra layer of pressure.
I wanted to ask you, Daniel, this is the first movie that you and I are reviewing. What was the impetus? Like, why this movie? Was it random, or?
Every time I've watched this movie, it's just spoken to me in a new way. This time it was much more just from like a filmmaking perspective. It's so impressive, especially for its time and apparently an extremely limited budget. But it's a film that I also want more people to watch, and I was 100% confident we'd have a lot to say on because it's just got so many layers. And even if you hate this movie, there's enough going on that you could talk about why you hated it for ages and ages. I mean, there's definitely some characters that feel kind of like unnecessary. It's a little over the top, a little blunt. But I think in terms of serving the purpose it's supposed to, I can think of few films that have done it better than 12 Angry Men.
Wow, that's an excellent first choice. And I also, I'm glad that you brought that up too, about having sort of a different perspective on it, a different take on it every time you watch it, because I felt the same way. I don't think I've seen this movie probably in 10 years or so, which would have put me like in about high school. And the first time I saw it, like, you know, I was really wowed by it. I was like, wow, this is like such an excellent display of like of argumentation, and it's like it's really well done, and it, you know, it tackles race, it tackles like peer pressure and sort of like groupthink and all of these things. And I wasn't thinking about how heavy-handed it was, right? Like you're 16, you're like, oh my god, this is incredible. Everyone should see this movie. And then you watch it with a little bit more age, and yeah, it does certainly come across in points as heavy-handed. But the other thing that I found too is like just doing sort of a deeper dive into it, like doing some more research on it. And the more I watch, the more movies that I add to my like repertoire of films that I've seen, the more I can appreciate not just like the subject matter, but yeah, how it's shot, like the camera work, the directing, the acting, like all of that stuff plays, you know, makes a quality film.
We've talked about all this, and we haven't even gotten into how freaking great the performances are across the board. Like, you could talk about every performance here. If you're supposed to hate a character, that actor is going to make you hate that character. Juror number 10, I wanted to throw into a meat grinder. Like, wow, everyone just gives it their all.
Sidney Lumet, the director of the film, had the actors together for 2 weeks rehearsing their scenes, like just like doing all of the rehearsing and doing all the lines and everything for 2 weeks, so that they had it everything down. They had a budgeted time of like 21 days to shoot the film, and they did it in 19.
Wow.
Which is like unheard of.
I have not warned you I'm going to do this, but to close out these episodes, I'm going to ask Noah this question every time, and I'm really excited to hear your answer. Do you think this movie should be remade today? Would it actually hit the same messages, mean the same? And if so, is there anyone you think who should do it in terms of direction or performance?
Yes, I do think it should be remade today. In fact, I think this is one of the movies that you could probably remake every 10 years or so, because you could tackle with sort of a different thing that's going on. Like one of the, you know, whatever main thing is happening in the world at that moment, I think you could probably do it every 10 years or so. And depending on who's doing it, you would either get a really quality film, or you would get something that feels rehashed and tired and is just hitting you over the head. In terms of who I think should do it or could do it, Christopher Nolan.
I thought you were going to say Jordan Peele, but you know, if you want the Batman treatment.
I'm glad you asked me that question, Daniel, because one of the things that I want to ask you on every episode that I have not told you about is like whether or not this movie still belongs on the list. And one of the things that I would like to do with you is to, you know, either like create our own list or take some of the movies out and replace them with something, because one of the things, the AFI 100 list has been done over and over and over again, right? People have watched these movies 1,000 times and they've talked about it 1,000 times, but it's like all these movies are from, you know, the like pre-1960s. They're mainly white casts. They're mainly directed by straight white men. Like I would love, and there's so many people, directors and actors coming out there today who are people of color, who are women, who are like in the LGBTQ community. Like I would love to see some films, like more representation on the AFI 100 list.
So that's a really interesting question, and I do think a lot of movies that are on AFI's list do need to be taken off, because I've seen them. I hate Gone with the Wind, and if we get to that, I'm gonna just tear it apart. So, like, there are definitely ones that should. So I do think there are many films on that list that we taken off. This is not one of them. This is a movie that I appreciate. Movies that also overcome a lot of hurdles, and as we've talked about, this movie had a few and still manages to just knife in that exact line it's walking. So this I would keep on my personal list. What about you?
I would agree with you. I would keep this on my list. 12 Angry Men is number 87 on the list. Higher, lower, or keep it the same?
Much higher for me. This is personally in my top 20 films.
Wow. Really? Okay, so that's significant.
Well, at the last episode of this show, or at least after we get through AFI's list, it'll be us putting up our own 100. How about that? And going over them.
Love that. I love that idea.
Okay.
Super big into that idea. I wouldn't put it as high as you. I would definitely move it above 87. I gotta be honest, I haven't thoroughly looked over AFI's top 100 list. So I don't have it all memorized. So I don't want to like bump it up to say like 50 and then forget that there are like 37 fantastic movies that should in fact be ahead of 12 Angry Men.
Well, the MCU is going to be his top 30 films, so like obvious.
That's true. And actually, Now that you bring it up, I think you can just do away with any sort of ranking of films because the MCU just really knocks it out of the park.
Thank you everyone for tuning in to our discussion of 12 Angry Men. We hope you've enjoyed it. Like and subscribe if you have not already, and hit the Patreon if you want to support what we do here. We're going to be going through AFI's Top 100, so if you would like to see that list yourself, it will be linked in the description down below. And of course, if this is your first time discovering me, I have a whole other YouTube channel right there. Have a good one, y'all. Bye!